They sent me to photograph a town no one visits anymore, and by sunset I found myself standing in front of a weather-beaten house, where a widow opened her door, looked into my tired eyes, and quietly invited me to stay for dinner. I thought it would be a simple meal. I had no idea that before the night ended, I would uncover a story that would change the way I looked at loneliness, loss, and the meaning of being remembered forever. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness still matters and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the Dad Chronicles for more heartfelt stories that stay with you long after they end. My name was Rowan Mercer, and I worked as a freelance photographer for travel magazines. Most assignments took me to beautiful places filled with tourists, excitement, and postcard-worthy views. This assignment was different. The editor had sent me to a forgotten town called Hollow Creek, a place so isolated that even online maps barely mentioned it. The article was supposed to focus on abandoned communities and fading rural America. Honestly, I expected empty streets, decaying buildings, and little else. The drive took most of the day. The farther I traveled, the narrower the roads became. Cell service disappeared. Gas stations became rare. By the time I reached Hollow Creek, the afternoon sun hung low over rows of silent buildings. The town looked frozen in time. Old storefronts stood with faded signs. Empty benches lined the sidewalks. The wind pushed dry leaves across the road, as if nature itself had become the town's last resident. I spent hours photographing everything. The abandoned diner, the boarded-up school, the rusted playground where no children laughed anymore. Every image seemed to capture the same feeling, a quiet sadness that settled over everything like dust. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered unexpectedly. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but the mountains surrounding the valley had their own plans. Rain began falling in heavy sheets. I hurried toward my truck only to discover it wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but the engine remained silent. The nearest motel was more than 40 miles away. For the first time that day, I felt genuinely uneasy. The rain intensified. Thunder echoed across the valley. Through the curtain of water, I noticed a single porch light glowing at the far end of the street. It was the only sign of life I had seen since arriving. With no better option, I grabbed my camera bag and walked toward it. The house was old but carefully maintained. Flowers bloomed beneath the windows despite the rough weather. The porch had been freshly painted. Someone clearly cared about this place. I knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. An elderly woman stood there. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her eyes carried a warmth that immediately softened the cold rain, soaking my clothes. She listened patiently as I explained my situation. Without hesitation, she welcomed me inside and invited me to stay for dinner while the storm passed. The house smelled of fresh bread and rosemary. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. Some were decades old. Others showed smiling faces from more recent years. Yet despite all the pictures, the house felt strangely quiet, as though it had been waiting a very long time for company. The widow introduced herself as Miriam Hale. As she prepared dinner, I noticed an empty chair positioned carefully at the head of the table. It looked untouched, almost sacred. Outside, the storm raged harder. Inside, Miriam moved through the kitchen with practiced grace. For the first time all day, I felt at peace. During dinner, she shared pieces of her life. Her husband, Everett, had passed away 8 years earlier. They had spent their entire lives in Hollow Creek. When the factories closed and jobs disappeared, families slowly moved away. One by one, houses emptied. Businesses shut their doors. Children grew up and settled elsewhere. Soon, only a handful of residents remained. Then even they left. Eventually, Miriam became one of the last people still living there. As she spoke, I realized something heartbreaking. The town wasn't abandoned because people hated it. It had simply been forgotten. After dinner, Miriam showed me a small room where she kept hundreds of old photographs. Some dated back nearly a century. Weddings, school graduations, harvest festivals, baseball games, birthday parties. Entire generations of families stared back from those images. Every face represented someone who once called Hollow Creek home. Many were gone now. Others lived far away. Yet Miriam preserved every memory carefully. The collection wasn't just a family archive. It was the history of an entire town. She explained that after Everett died, Preserving those memories became her purpose. She feared that if the photographs disappeared, it would be as though the people themselves had never existed. Her words stayed with me. As a photographer, I had spent years chasing beautiful images. But standing there among those fading photographs, I realized that the most valuable pictures weren't always the most impressive. Sometimes they were simply proof that someone had lived, laughed, loved, and mattered. The storm finally eased near midnight, but I wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. The next morning, sunlight spilled across Hollow Creek. Instead of finishing my assignment and heading home, I asked Miriam if I could photograph her collection. She agreed. For 2 days, I documented every album, every picture, every handwritten note attached to the images. I listened to stories about the people in them. Teachers, farmers, veterans, parents, children. By the end, I felt as though I knew them personally when I returned to the city. I couldn't stop thinking about Hollow Creek. The article I submitted became something entirely different from what my editor expected. Instead of focusing on abandonment, I wrote about memory. I wrote about Miriam. I wrote about the responsibility we have to remember people who shape the communities we inherit. The story spread farther than anyone imagined. Thousands of readers shared it. Former residents of Hollow Creek saw the article and reached out. Families who hadn't visited in decades returned. Descendants recognized faces from Miriam's photographs. Letters arrived. Phone calls followed. Then visitors began coming. Not in huge numbers, but enough. Enough to remind the town that it still existed. Enough to remind Miriam that she had not been forgotten. Several months later, I returned to Hollow Creek. This time, the streets weren't completely empty. A few families walked through town. Children played near the old park. Cars lined parts of the road. And when I arrived at Miriam's house, I found her smiling brighter than I had ever seen before. The porch was filled with visitors listening to stories about the town's past. For the first time in years, the silence was gone. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like, comment, and share. Stories like these survive because people choose to pass them forward. Special request. Comment below with the name of someone you never want to be forgotten. As the sun began setting over Hollow Creek, I took one final photograph. It wasn't of a building or a landscape. It was of Miriam standing on her porch surrounded by people. Her face reflected something that had been missing when I first met her. Connection. Belonging. Hope. Driving away, I realized that my assignment had never really been about a forgotten town. It had been about a forgotten lesson. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness isn't changing someone's life. Sometimes it's simply showing up, listening to their story, and helping the world remember they were here. And all of it began because a widow opened her door on a rainy evening and quietly said, "Stay for dinner." Some invitations feed the body. Others feed the soul. That one did both.